And I'm happy to welcome back to the show for a return visit. He is Father Bill Nicholas with the Archdiocese of San Francisco, out here on the left coast, but much further north than where I'm sitting in beautiful San Diego. Father Bill Nicholas, good to have you back. Thank you for spending time with us today.
Good to be back with you, Greg. Good to see you again.
Now, likewise. Now listen, much has been made in the intervening couple of weeks since the president made his big announcement on the emergency border declaration. And certainly politicians are going to politic in the way you would expect, right? They're going to have certain people say that they disagree with it. Others are going to say that it's the right move, and others still to be determined. And we know this is going to probably end up, in the courts at some point. And it's how our process works. But it's so interesting to watch the news coverage and how they make this like, this is the only time this kind of a fight has happened between the president and the Congress going to fisticuffs, basically. Well, no, we've been here before, and it's why I wanted to bring you on, because as a great student of history, you can take us down the road featuring a different president and a different Congress in a similar sort of Donnybrook. Tell us about it, Father.
It's interesting, and you and I have made the same comparisons. We've had this discussion before, and if there's one president I hope people learn about during the presidency of Donald Trump, whether it's 4 years or 8 years, is the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who President Trump admires. I mean, early on, he moved Jackson's portrait into the Oval Office. He made, I guess, a pilgrimage, if you will, down to the Hermitage, his home, and gave a speech there. But when I see the so-called conflict, or they would say war, with Congress on the border issue, on the border wall, I found it very similar or reminiscent to the bank war that they speak of during the presidency of Andrew Jackson regarding the Bank of the United States. Now, the Bank of the United States was the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, who has a very popular musical out these days, so people know who he is and who he was. And he conceived the idea of the Bank of the United States. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were both against this because they felt it favored the merchants and the investors more than the common American. But George Washington, rather reluctantly, agreed and signed it into law. Well, the current charter of the Bank of the United States was due to expire in 1836. And that's getting a little ahead of ourselves, but it's important to note that because in 1832, in the summer, Andrew Jackson was finishing his first term and running for re-election against Henry Clay, who was an old rival of his. This was not the first time Henry Clay had run for president, and would not be the last. I'm sure we've heard that before in our current history as well. And Henry Clay wanted to establish a wedge issue that would be a defining issue in the re-election of Andrew Jackson and hopefully lead to his defeat. And that would be the Bank of the United States, which was not due to expire, the current charter, and for another 4 years. But Henry Clay decided to push through Congress a rechartering, a renewal of the charter, and handed it to Jackson, passed by Congress on the 4th of July, the summer of 1832. And the president of the National Bank, a man named Nicholas Biddle, was an ardent opponent of Andrew Jackson and a big supporter of Henry Clay. So naturally, Jackson would see that and see it not only as a political affront, but a personal affront on him. And he is quoted to have said, "The bank is trying to destroy me, but I will destroy it." And he took advantage, he invoked the 4th of July when he received this bill in his veto message when he sent it back to Congress. And so Henry Clay had his issue, and Jackson considered a mandate for his reelection. This is the choice in terms of who we elect or reelect for president. Well, as we know, Andrew Jackson was reelected as president. And when Congress was in recess, and we need to remember that Congress was not in session all year at that time. It was only 3 or 4 months out of the year, and then they went home for the remainder of the year. And so during the recess of the Congress, President Jackson decided in 1832-33, I'm not going to wait for the charter to expire. He ordered his Secretary of the Treasury, and he was already on his second Secretary of the Treasury, to withdraw the funds from the Bank of the United States and put them into various state funds. Well, his Secretary of the Treasury refused to do that, so Jackson fired him and appointed, recess appointment, a second Secretary of the Treasury. This is 1833, and told him to redirect the funds from the bank to state banks. Well, that Secretary of the Treasury refused to do it, so Jackson fired him, and now he's on his fourth Secretary of the Treasury, a man named Roger B. Taney, who later would meet notoriety as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for the Dred Scott decision. But he carried out President Jackson's bidding in redirecting the funds. So when Congress came back from their recess, you can imagine, everything exploded. First thing they did was the Senate did not ratify or consent to Taney's appointment as Secretary of the Treasury. So Jackson had to appoint his fifth Secretary to the Treasury. And then the Congress as a whole, for the first time and only time ever in our history, censured the president for his actions with regard to the National Bank. And he was formally censured by the Congress. But a couple years later, when his party, the Democrats, took over the Congress, they not only rescinded, but expunged the censure. So there was that back and forth between the president and the Congress regarding the National Bank. And by the time 1836 came around and the charter expired, the Bank of the United States was pretty much defunct, and Jackson had done away with it. And so when we see this back and forth between the president and the Congress, yes, for political reasons, but also for reasons which we assume they thought were best for the American people and America as a nation, we can certainly see similarities between that and the so-called war at the border, or war on the border wall, that we see today between President Trump and Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Charles Schumer in the Senate.
It is a remarkable parallel, right down to even the player personnel turnover there in the administration. Right, you have Jackson going through people super fast, and President Trump goes through them pretty quickly too.
Yeah, President Trump was nothing compared to Jackson. First of all, the cabinet was much smaller, but President Jackson, he had two vice presidents, and at one time had a time where he had no vice president. Let's see, it was 5 secretaries of the Treasury, 4 secretaries of state, 2 postmasters general, 2 secretaries of war, and 3 attorneys general throughout his presidency. And so you can imagine why he had his own kitchen cabinet, which was a much more reliable and closer group of friends and advisors that he had. But you often see the pundits in the news reacting to just 1 or 2 members of Donald Trump's cabinet resigning or being fired or simply moving to another position. But that's nothing compared to what we saw during the Jackson presidency. But the thing is, the president, in this case President Jackson, and in our case President Trump, they are the ones who were in charge, and the cabinet members work for him. And sometimes we often forget that certain jobs could potentially contradict the president, but in effect, they are working for the chief executive.
Sure. It's a remarkable thing. I mean, as the old cliche goes, everything old is new again. But we have been here before. We've certainly been more divided than we are right now. We saw that in the run up to the Civil War, and now we've seen this very interesting parallel that you've laid out between the National Bank and of course Andrew Jackson versus the Congress and the president on the border wall funding. We appreciate you making time for us today, Father Bill. Thank you so much for coming by and breaking down this swampiest of swamp stories, even back then. I appreciate you being here today, Father.
Good to be here, and look forward to seeing you again.